Today on NEWSGIRLS, Trump's healthcare experiment in Georgia. Today we're going to attempt the impossible, make healthcare interesting.
Conservatives now do seem to have a seed of a plan, work for care.
Meta censors political content.
People are pretty pissed.
If you're listening and you haven't opted out, then yes, political content is being hidden from you. And the battle over an $18 billion shipwreck.
It's all very national treasure. Emeralds, gold, and silver found 2,000 feet underwater.
Several different countries and groups think they have claim to the most valuable shipwreck in history.
Welcome to NEWSGIRLS.
I'm Wren.
And I'm Mabel.
Let's get into the stories.
Yes or no, you still do not have a plan?
I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now.
That was former President Donald Trump talking about his healthcare plan at the first and only debate against Vice President Kamala Harris last month.
We all know this clip. Even if you didn't watch the debate, it went super viral all over social media. And healthcare has always been a complicated and contentious topic in the U.S. It's actually the only developed country without universal healthcare. And Republicans specifically have come under fire for not having any real concept of a healthcare plan except to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Right, without a replacement plan ready, so 45 million people would just lose their insurance. And this isn't a new thing. I mean, Republicans have been vowing to get rid of Obamacare since it was passed. And I remember I worked on the 60 Minutes story on Trump before the 2020 election. And that was the one where he walked out in the middle and refused to come back and finish the interview. And while we were waiting to see if he was coming back, his press secretary came in with a giant book, like a 1,000-page book, and was like, here's the president's health plan. And we looked through it, and let's just say there was no health plan.
It was heavy, filled with executive orders, congressional initiatives, but no comprehensive health plan.
And that was 4 years ago when he was president.
But conservatives now do seem to have a seed of a plan, work for care. So basically, in order to get public health insurance, you have to have a job. And they're testing this out in Georgia, which the New York Times is calling a conservative laboratory to test out other forms of healthcare.
So today we're going to attempt the impossible, make healthcare interesting. Mabel, maybe it's better if we present this like a play or something.
Just envision that you're listening to this or watching a Broadway play by the NEWSGIRLS.
Act 1, setting the scene. Georgia has one of the highest uninsured rates in the country at 14%, or 1.4 million people living without care.
It's also one of the worst states in the country for women's health care. In most states, Medicaid kicks in if you're categorically poor or at least at federal poverty levels, which means that you're making less than $15,000 a year. But in Georgia, you only qualify for Medicaid, which is state or federal health insurance, if you also have a disability, are pregnant, are a child, or are over 65. So being just low income isn't enough.
Right, if you're below the federal poverty level but don't meet any of the other criteria, your only option for care is Georgia's Pathways program, a preview for what might be in store broadly under a second Trump administration.
Are you putting off a doctor visit, avoiding lab work, struggling to fill a prescription? Then you need to try Georgia Pathways, health insurance that gets you covered, with no copays. Visit pathways.georgia.gov to learn more and apply for benefits today.
Pathways is the country's first work for healthcare, so it requires at least 80 hours a month of work or school or volunteering in order to qualify.
Pathways was designed as a rebuttal to Medicaid and was basically founded on conservative ideals. So in order to be eligible for subsidized healthcare, you basically need to show an emphasis on personal responsibility. And this plan was developed by the Trump administration and our main character, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp.
Georgia Pathways and Access will provide the opportunity for thousands of hardworking Georgians to finally have health insurance coverage.
Kemp announced this plan for Georgia in 2019 as part of 13 states that were given permission by the Trump administration to enforce a work requirement. But then when Biden came in, he halted all of those programs. But Georgia sued Biden and won, so a federal judge allowed this work for care program to continue only in the state of Georgia.
And it's safe to say if Trump wins another term,
good foreshadowing,
his health department will encourage states to require work requirements for subsidized healthcare. It's actually such a big and important conversation right now that reportedly the prospect of a Republican-led Congress undermining public health care was so scary to Representative Nancy Pelosi that it was one of the major concerns that she had about Biden rerunning. And it makes sense because this plan is getting traction. So far, Arkansas, Mississippi, South Dakota, Kansas, and Idaho have all considered legislation to include work qualifications.
Act 2, what is Pathways? Pathways launched in 2023 with the goal of covering 100,000 Georgians in its first year and serving as a pathway to an education, a job, a career, and a better life without government assistance.
But in reality, Pathways has only managed to cover 4,500 people, which is a fraction of the 168,000 people that state officials have estimated are eligible. And so health and policy experts are saying that this low enrollment rate is an example of a fundamental flaw in Pathways, which leads us to our first conflict of the play. Drumroll, please. The work requirement is just too burdensome.
Pathways requires patients to document their work hours every month, which can be difficult for people who have informal jobs. Like, what if you're a house cleaner or you work odd jobs? Like, what documentation would you have to show?
Right, and how do you document hours if you perchance don't have internet or a computer? Like, I get figuring it out for once if you want to apply, but you have to document hours every month, and if you don't document hours for 3 months, you get kicked out of the program.
And there are no exceptions for people taking care of loved ones or lack transportation or suffer from drug addiction or any other barrier to employment. And people have pointed out, if you're struggling to put food on the table every month, adding one more involved task could be a lot.
Yeah, it's just a very oddly specific and limited plan. It's like they had one prototype of a person in their minds when they designed it. Most people in these positions don't qualify or can't keep up with requirements. So ultimately, Pathways is having a really hard time helping the people that actually need it.
Again, if you're a low-income adult that isn't pregnant and doesn't have a disability, this is your only way to get health insurance.
Yeah, and of the 100,000 people who applied, only 4,500 were accepted and currently have care.
Which brings us to conflict 2. So even though Georgia's goal with Pathways was to reduce the cost of care, $25 million of the $32.5 million spent on the program have been for administrative costs. Because the enrollment and monthly reporting process is so involved, the bulk of the funds, which come from taxpayers, have been going through managing the online portal and not into care.
Which is at odds with the Republicans' main complaint about Medicaid, which is that it's too expensive and that it costs the states too much.
Yeah, we've heard it broken down like Republicans see public health care as like welfare or cash assistance, and Democrats view it as insurance coverage.
Yeah, and that's the fundamental difference in how the two parties view public health care. But when it comes to what's happening in terms of efficiency in Georgia, analysis by Georgia Budget and Policy Institute found that Medicaid would get so much federal funding under full expansion that in its first year, the program could cover almost 500,000 residents, which costs the same as 100,000 Pathways recipients.
Wow. So Trump hasn't said anything about Medicaid. In fact, there are headlines calling his silence deafening, but Project 2025 calls for targeted time limits or lifetime caps on Medicaid.
Which leads us to Act 3, the future of this plan in Georgia.
So in defense of Pathways, our main character, Governor Kemp, has blamed the Biden administration for delaying the rollout and said their biggest obstacle right now is lack of awareness. So he's sinking $10 million into radio and TV ads, especially targeting low-income groups. And he's also doing outreach on college campuses. And for the relative few that are covered, it's been life-changing.
I was looking for insurance, low-income insurance, to help my son and I out because we didn't have insurance. I highly recommend Pathways to anybody that can use it and qualifies, and even use the doctor that I used before, which amazed me.
And beyond just giving healthcare coverage, Pathways does give access to other safety net programs like Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, which is a federally funded program that covers the cost of groceries. But of course, Governor Kemp has always said that the goal of Georgia Pathways has never been to cover hundreds of thousands of Georgians forever. It's to serve as a pathway.
Oh. And Pathways is up for renewal in September 2025, and Kemp has vowed to extend it. He's even suing the Biden administration right now to extend it to 2028. But if Trump wins, Kemp's worries about extension will immediately go away.
And since that presidential debate in September, more than 1,500 physicians have called on Trump to release a comprehensive healthcare plan. And he hasn't said much about it, but you really only have to look at Georgia to see what the future of healthcare could be in this country if he wins a second term.
But if Harris wins, it's safe to assume she'll move to strike down work for care programs.
Let's finally expand Medicaid in Georgia so people can take their child to a doctor or go to an emergency room without going into medical debt.
But of course, our administration can't just expand Medicaid, so it is ultimately up to the state of Georgia and Kemp. So we'll see what happens with Pathways. Will they keep it or tweak it or leave it?
And fiend.
So this past summer, Wren and I started posting news videos on TikTok and got a bitter taste of what it's like to be banned on social media.
We were bright-eyed, bushy-tailed new creators ready to change the world with our reporting, and then tragedy struck. Mabel, do you want to tell them what happened?
Yes. So I posted a video after the first presidential debate, essentially fact-checking Trump on immigration. In 2022, 89% of convicted fentanyl traffickers were Americans. This was all researched and sourced from media outlets and research papers, but nonetheless, TikTok banned the video and said that it wasn't eligible for recommendation on the For You page because it violates community guidelines.
Which was really confusing because we posted news every single day and never had a problem, and everything in your video was fact-checked and important for voters to hear.
Yeah, TikTok doesn't really explain the reason videos get banned, but we just kind of assumed that it was because it was politically controversial. And we did notice that throughout the summer, the more political the video we posted, the less likely it was to do well.
Even though half of TikTok users under 30 say they use TikTok to keep up with politics. And there are thriving political communities. Even I get a lot of my political information from TikTok.
Yeah, we're constantly sending each other political things on that platform.
So why are some videos like ours banned and others aren't?
And that brings us to the major point that we want to get into today, because it's not just TikTok. Meta recently rolled out a setting that reduces political content on Instagram accounts and Threads accounts. And in a post explaining the policy, Instagram said that they wanted to make their platforms a great experience for everyone.
These platforms just want it to be all sunshine and rainbows. So Meta immediately applied this policy to all public Instagram and Threads accounts. So if you're listening and you haven't opted out, then yes, political content is being hidden from you.
Yeah, stay tuned till the end of the video and we'll show you how to opt out of those settings.
But first, we have to break down all the backlash to this political suppression policy.
Instagram decided to remind us just how much they suck. And the default setting for everyone is limit the amount of political content.
Y'all know what the fuck y'all doing. Meta, they not for the people for real. They don't want us to know anything.
Further undermines access to credible political information, further threatening our already vulnerable information ecosystem.
We are continuously seeing attacks on censorship and freedom of speech, but specifically targeted towards people of color.
Politicians weighed in. Republican Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn questioned why Instagram is trying to suppress political content just months before the presidential election, and in her words, censor the democratic process.
And a couple of GOP congressmen actually wrote a letter to Zuckerberg questioning this decision because it limits the flow of information to citizens about elected officials.
And there was this big study that tracked a bunch of Instagram profiles that were affected by this change, like Hillary Clinton's, and found that the average engagement dropped 65% in the first 11 weeks after this policy was rolled out.
And even beyond politicians, political accounts like Feminist, which is an Instagram news account that posts information about women's and abortion rights, saw the reach of the account plummet from 10 million users to 800,000 in the week that the restrictions were announced.
That's a crazy drop.
Yeah, people are pretty pissed. Like, hundreds of content creators, activists, journalists, even meme account owners signed an open letter to Meta asking it to reverse its decision.
So to get an inside scoop, we spoke to Democratic strategist and content creator Keith Edwards. He has a social following of over 600,000, and he consults on political campaigns, and he was even invited to go to the White House to consult on their political strategy.
When I was first invited, I literally cried. I cried.
And we spoke to him about the impact that Meta's new policy has had on his career.
I remember where I was when I found this out. I was telling all of my clients, like, get on Threads, you know, and now I don't say that anymore. So they have really, like, killed the ability for accounts like mine to grow, but also for, like, us to be able to effectively communicate to voters. That's why social media is so important. Basically, political content, for better or for worse, is dying on their platforms because it is almost going to be impossible to grow in any meaningful way.
So that was shocking to hear that his whole strategy changed after Meta rolled out this policy. And that leads us to a big question. What is political content? It seems so vague and amorphous. And originally, Meta didn't even have a definition attached to their policy until there was backlash and they were pressed for one.
So Meta has now said that their definition of political content is likely to be about topics related to government or elections, for example, posts about laws, elections, or social topics. And they say that these global issues are complex and dynamic, which means this definition will evolve as we continue to engage with the people and communities who use our platforms and external experts to refine our approach.
Whew, that's a word salad. But we have to dissect that they lump in social topics under this umbrella too.
Right, which is so confusing because what's considered social topics is so intertwined with people's identities. There are reports that this policy significantly affected Black, women, LGBTQ, and disabled accounts. So if you identify as one of these people, should you just not post about yourself? It's weird and it's discriminatory.
Right, because sexual orientation, race, and disability are all considered social content under this political umbrella. So people are criticizing Meta for further marginalizing already marginalized voices.
Yeah, this is impacting even the Human Rights Campaign by over half.
Which is really sticky territory because that information should be seen by as many people as possible.
Yeah, it seems like everything is kind of falling into this bucket of, oh, this is political. But who gets to decide what is political and why? It just feels very arbitrary.
Well, it's ironic that Mark Zuckerberg is making all this hoopla right now about being apolitical and no longer involved in partisan politics. But at the end of the day, he's the one that gets to decide what is political for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people.
This all apparently stemmed from the January 6th attack on the Capitol in 2021. Meta was reportedly very sick and tired of everyone criticizing them for spreading misinformation and for all the hate speech and the partisan bias. So that was kind of when conversations started about how do they deprioritize political content and social issue content on their platforms. And I guess they decided that neutrality was a less risky option.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of reporting in recent days that this all stems back to Zuckerberg himself because he feels burned and regrets how involved he used to be in politics and has actually restructured the political teams at Meta and his foundation to focus on other things. And he used to be this big advocate for liberal causes, but reportedly this summer he's had 2 calls with former President Trump, and he wrote a letter to Congress against the Biden administration saying that he felt that they pressured him to suppress political content during COVID-19.
But of course, it's interesting how even though free political content is being limited, Meta's ad library reported that the company has raked in more than $4 billion in political and social issue ad spending since 2018. So clearly there are some exceptions.
Right. They're okay with politics heavying up their platform as long as they're getting paid for it. And as journalists, this hits really close to home because we need to be able to talk freely about political content and social content without fear of being punished.
Yeah, and it makes us question these platforms that we're reporting on because Meta basically helped create the society that all depends on social media for interaction and for information and has basically created this like version of reality that everyone is in and everyone depends on. So how is it fair to opt out of this world that they created so late in the game?
And is it fair to make this change in the lead up to a presidential election when it's objectively the most vital time of all for people to get political information?
I think where we are now is that we need to regulate these companies. I think that's where it is. I don't think they should just be able to make these decisions.
Well, maybe the backlash to this policy will be the first step to cracking down on these tech companies' insane power.
Though obviously government intervention in free speech has its own host of problems, we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, we'll show you how to opt out of the political restricted settings on your Instagram.
Yes, Mabel, will you walk us through?
So go to your Instagram profile and click the 3 horizontal lines on the right-hand side, and it'll take you to your settings and activity page.
Done.
And then scroll all the way down to where you see content preferences.
Got it.
Click it, and then click political content, and then don't limit.
Oh.
And now you're out.
Thank you. I'm so excited to get into our last story today. It's about the most valuable shipwreck in history and why several different countries and groups think they have claim to its $18 billion of treasure.
It's all very national treasure. There are emeralds, gold, and silver found 2,000 feet underwater, and the dispute over who owns all of this treasure has been raging on for decades, and the case is actually now being seen by the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague.
So let's go back 3 centuries to 1708 and imagine you're a Spanish sailor who just loaded up your ship with emeralds and gold and silver from Central America, and you're sailing away and you see the horizon in front of you and you feel the rocking of the waves and you feel the sun on your
friend. Let's get on with it.
Sorry. So the Spanish ship, the San Jose, was sailing off the coast of Colombia in hopes of taking the $18 billion of riches on board back to Spain when it was shot down by a British warship.
The British wanted to seize the ship and its treasures for their queen. The Spanish and the British were engaged in combat, fighting off of their ships for an hour until the British accidentally shot a cannonball into the San Jose's storage of gunpowder and explosives.
Such an easy mistake.
So obviously the ship blew up and everybody sank within minutes.
And so the treasure sat at the bottom of the ocean for centuries until the 1980s, when an American salvage company located the wreck and was able to verify it was indeed the San Jose by, I love this, the distinctive engravings of dolphins on the bronze cannons.
And so now we get into the dispute over, okay, who actually owns this treasure? So let's start with the Spanish. They obviously claim that the San Jose was their ship, and so they own all the cargo that was on the ship.
Saw that one coming. And then, of course, Colombia says they're the rightful owners since this was found in Colombian waters. And actually, the president of Colombia has said one of his goals by the end of his term in 2026 is to raise the ship and put it in a museum. But you'll see that's not as clear cut for them as you would think.
And then we have this American salvage company that actually found the treasure and claims that since it found the holy grail of shipwrecks, it deserves a piece of the pie. And that's where things get a little tricky.
Yes, so according to court documents, the salvage company handed over the coordinates of the shipwreck to the Colombian government with the understanding that it was entitled to half of the $18 billion of treasure. But before the ship could be raised, the laws in Colombia shifted, and the salvage company has found itself defending its right to the treasure in court for decades now.
And the conflict deepened even more in 2015 when the Colombian government said that they found the shipwreck completely separate from the American salvage company at a different location, even though the location was just a mile or two from the American coordinates.
So right now, the American salvage company is suing the Colombian government in front of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, which is, of course, one of the most powerful courts in the world.
But we're still not done with the list of people who claim they have the right to the treasure. So indigenous groups from Peru and Bolivia are saying that they were enslaved by the Spanish and basically forced to mine these precious metals in the Andes where they lived, and then were obviously forced to give all of their wealth to the Spanish. So now these indigenous groups are trying to stop international governments and treasure hunters from taking all the gold and silver that they say belongs to their people.
But the atrocities of imperialism don't end there, because the Spanish also forced the indigenous Bolivian Caracara people and enslaved African workers in New Grenada to mine precious metals for them as well. So their descendants have also made a claim.
And then there are the archaeologists and historians who think that the shipwreck should just be left alone. And there are differing opinions as to why, but some maritime experts are saying that the San Jose is a graveyard and should be respected as such since 600 people drowned that day. And others say that the ship should be left in peace and explored as an artifact on the ocean floor.
Nautical archaeologists, which we didn't even know was a thing, have said any kind of disturbance to the site would be ill-advised because, to quote them, the ship has reached equilibrium with the environment and the materials have been under these conditions for 300 years, so there's no better way for them to be resting.
It's interesting just how complicated this case is. You think there would be laws about property underwater and claims at sea already, but apparently the UN says that there are 3 million sunken vessels on the ocean floor, and there is very little clarity on who has the right to explore or keep it.
Well, we tried to do some research into if there's any legal standing for one of these entities over the others. And we found in 1982, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is considered the Constitution of the Oceans. But weirdly, it says very little about shipwrecks. So because of that, the UN adopted a second set of rules in 2001 called the UNESCO Underwater Cultural Heritage 2001 Convention. Just rolls off the tongue. That says more about wrecks, but a lot of countries have refused to ratify it because they're afraid it will weaken their claims to what they find underwater.
And it's important to note that the US and Colombia have not signed it.
I wonder why not.
So as of now, the Hague case is still pending. And in this atmosphere where everyone is questioning what ownership actually means, especially when it comes to art and artifacts and precious metals in museums, this case is bound to set a real big precedent.
Yeah, the San Jose went down in the era of finders keepers. So if the ship had just sailed back to Spain as planned, the riches, the treasure would be squarely in Spanish possession and would not be up for any kind of discussion. And same with if British had conquered the ship, which they did all the time, then it would be in British possession and there would be no debate about it. But because it happened to sink, we even get to have this conversation. But Mabel, if you were a judge at The Hague, who would you say deserves the treasure between the Spanish, the Colombians, the American Salvage Company, and the indigenous groups?
Okay, if I were a judge at The Hague, I would say that Colombia definitely deserves at least some of it, because in the most basic legal way, it was found under their waters, so they deserve some of the treasure.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'd give a cut to the American Salvage Company for finding it, and then a cut to the indigenous groups as a form of reparations, and then I'd give the rest to Colombia.
None for the Spanish, sorry.
Well, thanks for listening. We'll continue our special election coverage next week.
Bye.